This podcast is brought to you by Ziva, Functional Training Institute's exclusive equipment partner. Engineered for purpose and performance, Ziva's elite equipment supports every rep, every move, and every goal. It's Coach Tarek, the host of the Purpose-Driven Movement podcast. My guest today is Dr. Stephen Bird, who's a professor of exercise and sports science, an author, a high-performance coach, and a tremendous entrepreneur. In this episode, Dr. Stephen Bird discusses the recipe of success regarding recovery training and looking at the 4 formulas that make up recovery training and really how to gamify a recovery training for high performers, anyone who's in the corporate space or the athletic space, or you're a personal trainer with your clients. How to incorporate recovery is essential. We also look at the complexities of health and performance during an intensified training camp. So that's specific for performance coaches, athletes, sporting teams. And lastly, we look at the success formula for high performers. There are a lot of tips and tricks and hacks in this episode not to be missed. Check out the Functional Training Institute's latest offer, which is 15% off of any of our online training courses. Simply go to functionaltraininginstitute.com and input PDM15 at cart checkout. Welcome, folks, to the Purpose-Driven Movement podcast. I've got a very special guest today, a friend of mine, Dr. Stephen Bird, who I've known for a number of years now. Welcome to the podcast, Stephen.
Thanks for having me. Look, it's been a minute since we caught up last. We had some really good discussion early on in the piece, and it's always easy to spend time, and time goes very quickly when you're talking to a like-minded person such as yourself. And I know last time we hooked up, we ended up talking for quite some time before we had to move on. So I look forward to unpacking some of the areas we want to talk about today.
Most definitely. I recall back in 2019 at the gym I had at the time there in Caringbah, and you went to pick up some weight plates that you needed to borrow, and I was like, okay.
Exactly right. That's COVID times.
Yeah. Oh, that was even 220, at that time. But that's where we always, kind of refer back to that point and go, wow, 4 or 5 years later. Terrific to have you, mate. And it's always an honor to chat with you. Your wealth of knowledge and your background's tremendous. And today we've got a lot of stuff to talk about. And before that, I'd love to just dive into a little bit more about yourself in light of the context of this conversation, which is about the complexities of health and performance during an intensified training camp. So we'll certainly dive into that. And of course, if you could share a bit more about yourself, mate.
Yeah, certainly. So my current role is I'm a professor in sport and exercise science at the University of Southern Queensland. So we have campuses at Ipswich, we have a campus at Toowoomba and also Springfield. Part of my role here is to look at leveraging sport, and specifically how our disciplines within the School of Health and Medical Sciences can engage with sporting opportunities and working with athletes across a whole range of disciplines, whether that's sport and exercise science, strength and conditioning, physiotherapy, psychology, occupational therapy. There's a number of disciplines that we can work with in that space. Obviously, being in Queensland, everyone's very excited about 2032. Obviously, the Olympics in Brisbane is a key driver of that. And I'm very, very passionate about one particular area in athlete development, and that area is the student-athlete transition. So how we can actually have athletes transition from pre-elite youth programs into senior programs. And we hope that those kiddies that are, 13, 14 and 15 now will be the senior representatives in the Olympics as we head towards Brisbane 2032. So that's one particular role. My other roles are a strength and conditioning lead for GB basketball with the women's senior national team. Shout out to those players. They've just qualified for Eurobasket. So I'll be heading back over to the UK in the coming months as we're in the final preparation stages for the final 16 teams in Eurobasket. And then pinning that all together, as you're aware, is obviously we continue to work in the space around a book we published a couple of years ago now called When Winning Matters, and continuing to work chapters of that book with different organizations and how we can have this metaphor of success in sport and success in business and life. So they're the sort of 3 things that are consuming my time at the moment. Obviously, spending time with my wife and my children is in there as well. So times are busy and fulfilling at the moment.
Yeah, that's the key, isn't it? To not just be busy, but being fulfilled with what you pursue, both in your personal and business life as well. And thank you really for sharing that. So, and of course, we'll have more information on your bio, and you've generously put forward some different links here, which articles that you've been involved in writing. So really appreciate that. And I know how I found out about you was through the sort of recovery checklist system that you created way back, I believe, for the Indonesian athletes. And I really want to start with that and that story, because when I asked you that, it was like quite compelling. And I thought, geez, what a difference something like a checklist system in the context of recovery kind of made in the story you shared. And I believe that the listeners will get a lot out of this. So would you mind starting with that story, Stephen?
Yes, certainly. Look, that goes back to 2006 of all times. And I was working with the Indonesian Ministry of Sport at that point in time with their high performance program. When you were working in Indonesia, one of their priority competitions with the Southeast Asian contingent is the Southeast Asian Games. And we started working that program, 850 athletes in the program. And early on, what we found was an area where we could get benefit for the athletes and the coaches was around a focus on recovery. Now, what I want the listeners to appreciate, it's not like I'm working with one team, a rugby league team or a netball team, and I'm going to take those athletes in to an aquatic center. We'll do a hydro aquatic session, or we'll do some mobility. 850 athletes, 30 odd provinces, all spread across Indonesia. Now, we both know, Tarek, that athletes in particular, and not just athletes, but high performers, and we're going to use that term as we move through our discussion today, they're very single-minded and very competitive by nature. So what we looked at that point was how can we engage them through education and competition? The education piece was around here are the recovery modalities which we feel are most useful once we highlighted 4 specific recovery domains, those being substrate, fueling, muscular, neural, and psychological. So we have these 4 specific recovery domains. We then looked at the efficacy around the recovery strategies that were linked to each of those domains. We then put in a nominal loading of what the recovery points would be if they used a particular strategy. Putting those 2 things together, the recovery checklist with our nominal points, the competitive nature of the athletes, we then challenged the athletes to accrue a certain number of recovery points in a week. So given that there was a very high, as you can appreciate, athletes training for international competition, high training volume. So our goal was to challenge the athletes to accrue a certain number of recovery points. That was 2006. We then used that again in 2008 for the Olympic program. And then we published those works in 2011. And even to today, we use them as part of one of my roles going into sporting environments at the moment and conducting systematic reviews of processes. We often implement the recovery checklist point system today in different iterations, whether that's a 24-hour recovery checklist, if you're in an intensified competition or training schedule, a 48-hour, if you have back-to-back games, or it may be a seasonal week-to-week in a competition. So we've used that quite a lot, and I'm sure that the listeners will be able to jump online and have a look for that. They'll find lots of iterations of it, but something that we still use a lot today, both in our education and our practice with all high-performing athletes and personnel.
Yeah, it's brilliant. The gamification around it, and of course in the context of high performers or competitive people such as athletes. Yeah, because obviously that inspired me to adapt that and of course give you credit. And we did that webinar together back in late 2018. And to this day, it's still those who go through education are able to view that and see the system and how it's adapted even for general populations. And again, using that really wisely because there's different personality types. Some might go, hang on, I don't need that, and of course, in the context of the competitive environment, you've got a personality collective that really out of necessity kind of needs to strive for something like that. The thing that compelled me mostly was I recall the conversation we had that prior to that being implemented, there wasn't really obviously a culture, let's say, of appreciating recovery. But what was it before and after, just in a nutshell?
The focal point was on the training, for sure, not necessarily on what you and I would see today, which is a much greater holistic approach to health and well-being within high-performing personnel. And we use that in relation to athletes. So high push on the athletes themselves. Once we were able to implement that, and people that have been in Southeast Asia specifically will appreciate more so, it is about the education of the process and providing understanding to the coaches and the practitioners of the why. Why are we implementing these particular practices? And then with that being said, the athletes, they were able to notice themselves on those days when they were having higher or low training volumes. They could noticeably tell the difference on the days when they had accrued the nominal recovery points they were after 24 hours prior. So the next day effect, they could feel an effect either better or worse with how they were performing in their training if they had or had not accrued their recovery points the day before. There was definitely an improvement in the focal point around recovery. It was an easy way to develop a competitive environment for the athletes to look at recovery, and the education for the coaches was a key component of the successful implementation of that. And the iterations we use today are the same, except we go about asking the athletes first and foremost, how do they feel today? And we give them 4 specific scenarios. What is their level of muscular stiffness? How heavy do their legs feel? How irritable do they feel? And how lethargic do they feel? Now, if we think about those things, stiffness, leg heaviness, irritability, and lethargic. So stiffness, we look at the neural domain for recovery. Heavy legs, we look at the muscular domain for recovery. Irritability, we'd look at the psychological domain for recovery. And then in lethargy, we'd look at the substrate domain for recovery. So first off, we'd have the athlete look at those different areas. They would ask themselves how they feel. Then they go to our checklist and they find, okay, here are the recovery strategies for substrate. Here are the recovery strategies for psychological. And then they would go through and choose, giving some autonomy to the athlete to choose what strategies would I like to use based on how I currently feel today. And one of the things I see a lot with early career coaches coming through, it's like they want to throw all the toppings on the pizza at once, all right? And we know that the key principle for us is around individualization. So we need to be able to individualize the process for, in this case, the athlete. And the importance is the athlete answering those questions. Which one of these am I feeling today? Oh, look, it's lethargy. I need to go to my substrate recovery domain and look at what can I do to improve the amount of energy that I have. So really linking that now to those 4 areas of stiffness, heavy legs, irritability, and lethargy helps the athlete determine which type of domain they need to focus their recovery on.
Maps back to those 4 pillars that you mentioned earlier, the substrate, muscular, neurology, and psychology. So it's amazing. There's 2 things that really come, really spell out here. And the first, it's they have a neurological experience. So that means that they feel it. And that's the key here is it's not just an intellectual like, oh yeah, I'll just listen to coach or, the doctor or whoever, but it's like the experience of it, which I believe is very clever. And secondly, it's using self-determination theory of motivation and autonomy specifically as the second phase or second option. And I think those 2 things, Stephen, are so important. And it doesn't matter in what domain, right? Whether it's an academic or in performance, or if it's a personal trainer training their client, there's really something to be said about the experience of something that they're undertaking with you as the coach, and you give them a task or an activity. And therefore the underpinning thing is the why at the very beginning, which I believe is such a beautiful process. I wanted to remark on that.
Absolutely. And I think with any of the occupational or high performance personnel we work with, one of the goals that we have, and I think this is a really challenging component for a lot of practitioners, and that is how do we develop the buy-in? So if we're asking this athlete or high-performing practitioner or occupational to invest their time and energy into something that we feel is important to help them with their preparation and performance, but it needs to be self-driven. So the education is really important, and then the autonomy is really important to allow them to have scope to have a look at what is it that I need to do today to be able to present the best version of myself in the next training session that I have today, or the next occupational setting I'm going to find myself in. I need to present myself as the best version possible. Our goal is to come up with some tools to be able to use with them, but the buy-in portion, irrespective of the domain, whether it's, as you said, academic, high performing, occupational, they need to be self-driven to engage in the process.
Well, you have a philosophy around education and experience, which we'll talk on later, which is a nice tie-in. Now, kind of now we can launch a bit more into the main topic, but I thought that having a grounding in your background, the recovery checklist system and so forth is crucial here. Let's dive into kind of the complexities of health and performance in that competitive window. You want to talk more a little bit, talk more of that, and then we'll kind of dive into the specifics.
For sure. So if you look at where we go into very intensified training schedules and condensed competition periods. So for the listeners, this is not, the NRL has just started recently in Australia. So everyone has their favorite rugby league team playing week by week by week by week over a number of weeks before they then hopefully are able to qualify for the finals. But there's 20 plus weeks of competition. That's a different scenario to what we see ourselves with elite international tournament play. And that is usually an intensified training schedule followed by a condensed competition period. And that could be upwards of 14 days where the players may go into camp for a period of days, 4, 6, 7 days, where they're training twice a day. Those players are flying in from multiple locations around the world as part of a national team. They arrive. We have tour-a-days, training for a period of days. Then they will play an international game. The next day, followed up with international travel to another location. And then the day after that, another international game. So over a 10 to 12-day period, they've got international travel to the site of location for the training camp, a number of training days where we're doing tour-a-days, an international game, another travel day, and then we go to competition again. So that scenario certainly presents some complexities when you're looking at how can I maintain both health and performance. And there's a reason we say health before performance in our setting, because those things go hand in hand. If we don't have an athlete that's healthy, we're going to reduce their availability. And there's a lot to be said about, the saying of your best ability is your availability. So making our goal, we are focused on having all of the players available for the coach to give the coach the headache of who do they need to select, because all of the players on the roster are available and fit. So in that context, it can be a challenge, and I'll give you 3 specific scenarios in relation to that. So we have 15 players coming into camp. We have, of those 15 players, first consideration, 3 players will be cut from the roster, which will leave us 12. So players come into camp, they know that 3 are going to be let go. They're not going to make the final roster to go in. So that has some complexity itself in how do we deal with each individual, ensuring that they present the best version of themselves every single day. From that, we have players arriving from 5 to 6 different countries into camp. So obviously there's some time zone changes. We need to look at what procedures we're putting into place with our travel management for those players so that on day 1 of training, they're ready to go. If we look at the complexities, the training schedule planner itself. So how are we going to prepare training? I need to look at the availability of the facilities. So the courts, the weight room, the recovery center, and then the travel. There's 4 areas that just go into my training schedule planning that I need to consider. The second part of that is around the player management themselves. So player management, both fatigue and recovery monitoring. So what sort of athlete monitoring system will we use? Are we going to use something that's online? Are we going to use something that's written in real time while we're there? How are we going to quantify their work? How much time they're on their feet on court? Is it just time on feet? Is it GPS data? Is it distance? Is it player load? What recovery strategies do we need on that day based on the activity they've undertaken? Is it a strength training session where we might have some more muscular soreness, for example, in the gym? Is it blunt force trauma where we've had some collisions and contact in training? Is it eccentric loading, so putting the brakes on, sprinting down court, slamming the brakes on, and then a rapid change of direction? So those different actions will have different responses to how their body copes with that. And then finally, the nutrition area to support their needs. So from player management perspective, we're looking at those. And then the final part of that, the third part, will be just the strength and conditioning programming. So what are we doing in relation to pre-training, pre-game routines for the players? Where are we with tendon health within the playing group? What will be our exercise selections and progressions for the players? What is our equipment availability? And then obviously, what's our session and player goals? So when we start to look around the complexities, just from a strength and conditioning perspective, the training schedule and planner, the player monitoring itself, and then our strength and conditioning programming are all areas that we need to consider.
Wow, that is a lot of consideration. One thing that struck me as you were talking about this is they're perhaps going to have some prior commitments with their clubs, right? Their club sports. So they're flying in maybe from, if it's basketball in your case, the France or somewhere in Europe versus the States or Australia. So obviously geographically you're going to have these challenges. But my point being is it needs to fall in conjunction, the programming with what they're doing in the club. So can you talk more about that and how you maybe harmonize?
Yeah, look, the key component that we're working really hard on within the current program, so with GB Basketball, is having very open and honest upfront conversations. And I think that is the key with any program. And I've said this 1,000 times. Athletes are the best at smelling the BS. They just want someone to be open and honest with them about how they're doing right now. As an athlete at an elite level, obviously, they may have been very talented as a junior and they've been told their whole life how good they are. But they just want someone to be open and honest with them about, okay, currently, this is what your data tells us about your physical condition. These are the key areas we need to improve to optimize your performance, whether it's on court or within your occupation. So for the clubs, it's about us developing relationships through communication. And one of the keys for us is to make sure that any of the communication that we present has a high level of clarity. Nothing causes fear greater than confusion. And as soon as we get in a position where there's a lack of clarity, there's an increase in confusion, there will be some withdrawal because of the fear factor of not knowing. So for us, the clarity piece in our communication is critical in developing confidence in these two-way, open, honest discussions.
Could you give an example, or maybe one that you've experienced, whether a negative one or a positive one around that clarity?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I go back to my initial time in Southeast Asia, one of the things looking back now in reflection often wasn't clear enough with the coaches that I was working with around the why. There was this expectation, and expectation is a really dangerous place to go when you are considering there's a level of assumed knowledge, and you're expecting them to have an understanding, or they would have an idea of, okay, this is why we would be doing what we're doing. So I did have a couple of instances early on in the piece, and that was the wonderful thing about my time working in Southeast Asia, was it taught me how to be a better communicator and the importance of communication. Now, whether that communication is through verbal, through body language, or through written. What I was able to learn from my time in Southeast Asia was improving my ability to be a more concise communicator. And I think that's a critical thing for all aspiring coaches, whether they're personal trainers or in strength and conditioning field. Communication is critical, and being able to communicate whatever the message is, because your communication style may need to change. The message will be the same, but how I communicate that message to the athletes, I might use a different vocabulary to how I'm presenting that message to the front of office staff, to the team manager or the owner. And that might be the same message, but I'm just delivering it in a different way. So my communication skills had to improve throughout that period of time.
Yeah, and that must tie back into the overall culture, right? So the culture within the national team or the club itself, that would have a rub-on effect. And you talked earlier about trust and honesty as being key. And that must mean an open receiving of feedback or feed forward from, the athlete's perspective, and then the coach giving that feedback. Did you want to touch on that a little bit and the importance of culture in that context?
Yeah, look, culture is one of those things that I've been fortunate enough to work with a number of coaches, and one in particular, Rob Beveridge, and Bevo, as he's aptly known to his friends, was the co-author on When Winning Matters with myself. And one of the things that working with Bevo in his time at the Perth Wildcats, it was very obvious to see what culture, and when we talk about culture, we're talking about high performance culture, right? What is it that makes winners winners and everybody else? So what is the difference between those two? And one of the things that Bevo would often talk about was the importance of everybody having a solid understanding of the vision and the mission. The vision and the mission, being very clear about what those two areas are. Because with both of those areas, there becomes a level of non-negotiable behavior that everybody in the organization must display in order to be in line with the vision and the mission. So the example I'll give you is, if you think about, everyone talks about team values. What are the team values? And those that have a really good culture have very strong team values. Now, your team values are only as good as the people that you have involved that are prepared to demonstrate the non-negotiable behavior that goes to that value. Now, the value I'll give you that is quite often spoken about is commitment. So we're going to have commitment as one of our key values within the culture we're setting at the club. My question is, what does commitment look like? How does somebody display with their behavior that they're meeting that value of commitment? So what would happen is Bevo would then have the senior playing group come up with a list of non-negotiable behaviors that display commitment. Turning up on time. When I say turn up on time, that means for the playing group being there early, ready to go. Conducting purposeful practice, not just practice, but the practice needs to be purposeful. Taking on feedback and giving feedback to your peers. So now I'm committed to the process, I'm turning up early, and I'm conducting my practice in a purposeful manner. So here are 3 particular non-negotiable behaviors that are linked to the value, which is commitment. So creating that culture in a high performance environment is having high clarity on the vision and the mission and what the values are, the vision and mission, and then what the non-negotiable behaviors are that align with those three core pillars. So I think those teams, and everybody knows different sporting organizations that are the best of the best. They're on top of their game. And what you'll find will be a reoccurring theme across those organizations. The values, the mission, and the vision are so well aligned that everybody in the organization, their non-negotiable behaviors will display what they're looking for in the values, the mission, and the vision.
It's ultimately embodied, like we discussed earlier, and you talked about buy-in. And I think that buy-in happens over, I imagine, some key activities where, whether it's the national team or the club culture, that it's not just something brushed over, right? It's going to be seriously considered at that top level and then filtered into certain activities that still form part of the overall training plan, right? We think the training plan is a physiological thing, but it's not just that, right? Like you're discussing, there's these cultural factors, there's the standards that you set in addition to your recovery and the physiological components, which is the total training plan. Isn't that kind of what you were conveying earlier?
We always come back to a phrase that I heard a long time ago now, which is that your minimum standards become your highest standards. And so we use that a lot with all of the organizations we go in. When we walk in there to do a systematic review of processes, the first question I'll ask is, what are your minimum standards? Because in my eyes, that's where the bar is set. So your minimum standards are actually your highest standards. So let's look at those and what do we need to take them to the level where you think they align more importantly with your culture, and what then success looks like for your team and your organization. Now, success may not necessarily be winning the championship. Everybody aspires to that. But what's the reality in sport? There's one team that wins the championship. Everyone wants to do it, but there's only one that's successful. So what is it that success looks like within your organization? Is it that you're developing a really good youth roster coming through? Is it that you've improved your final standing on the table compared to last year? Is it that your processes in your player management have improved and we've actually used less players on the roster this year because we've been able to better manage everything around player management, player load, injury, player welfare? So success may look differently to different organizations than just winning the championship.
Yeah, well said. And I think the key there is the process. You know, it could be a number of months, if not years, to change a culture within a team or an organization, to have that winning mentality, you know, as you would say it. And of course, have that win-win mentality. It's not just like a win-lose or, you know, in the end, like this competitive beast that wants to conquer. Of course, it transcends that completely to a point where that winning mentality is still there, even if you don't win that championship.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I want to put a shout out and make sure the listeners go and look up Inky Johnson, INKY Johnson. Inky's story is super inspirational, and I'm not going to give it away. I want the listeners to go and look it up. But suffice to say, Inky would always talk about, you know, it's process over product. Get the process right and the product will come your way, whatever that product is that you're looking for. So process over product is critical. And key to that, if you're looking at getting improvements, it's all centered on commitment and accountability. So how is it that you're linking commitment and accountability to your core values? And then what are the behaviors that you need your staff, you need your players, you need your organization to display that meet those core values that you're looking at? And commitment and accountability are two of the regular themes that often come up. And when you look at some of the other organizations, especially in America, American leagues, they'll often use the term win now. So we're in a win now mode. So we feel like our processes are on point. What do we need to do in order to win now? So that would tell you that organization has been through their transition. Okay, they've transitioned from where they were. We've had a rebuild, and now we're in a win now type scenario. And I think that the differences between the transition and coming through, building to the win now mentality have a lot to do with where that team was or the players were at and where they are obviously right now. So, and I think there's a lot to be said about Inky Johnson's wise words around, you know, it's process over product.
Yeah, completely. And that sort of win now means that you're in that moment and you've put on that mindset, if you will, and every moment counts rather than just projecting into the future, you know, we're going to win later, or it's present moment, which I just think is terrific. Some real golden nuggets there. I wanted to go back to the obstacles though around the training camp. And, you know, in particular, you've got all of these pressures. You've got a bit of a pressure cooker environment in a sense from what you're talking about. So how do you and your team go about sort of of managing when things go wrong. It could be the geographical considerations, delays in flights, or sickness then ensues, or just that absolute fatigue from travel versus those time pressures that come with that. And then the logistical issues, you have outside factors. I mean, geez, it just sounds like potential, so many things that can go wrong. Like, how do you go about, from your experiences, just managing that and knowing that when something does fall to shit, if you like, you have a plan, you're not reacting, but you're responding, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've sort of answered the question somewhat right there, that, the details are in the planning for sure, right? Like everything we do from the travel day, what time we want the players to arrive, what time we want the players to get up, where are we today with our travel nutrition, where are we today with our travel hydration. That's just one component where we've looked at timings, food and hydration. Then it's okay, when we get to the airport, if there is a delay, what are we going to do? Do we have activities to do for the players to maintain some general movement? We're talking about long-bodied, long-limbed athletes that often get cramped in small places, i.e. planes. So we need to ensure that we have timings where if the plane gets delayed, we can have this mobility circuit. We can do these MOBS exercises, these activation exercises. We can do a banded resistance session. So we have plans in place that allow us to turn those moments into other opportunities. And that's the mindset that we're trying to enlist within this group. And the head of medical and performance has a really detailed eye when it comes to making every minute matter, because our goal is to assist the player, as we've already mentioned, to present their best version of themselves next time they hop on court. So what is it that we can do, in those moments to make those minutes matter most for us at that particular point in time? So planning is critical. Obviously, there's going to be times when things just go wrong and the plan doesn't work. And look, athletes, they're person first, athlete second. They have feelings, they have emotions. We just need to make sure that we have all of the staff possible in the roles they need to be in to assist the athlete to be able to prepare the best version of themselves, whether that's our psychologist, sports psych, medical, soft tissue, S&C, performance scientist, assistant coach, head coach, team manager. All of those people are involved in trying to assist that athlete to present their best version of themselves. So the open discussions are having quite frequently with putting the plans together so that we can hit the ground running, so to speak, with the athletes.
Yeah, I love how you got those strategies, those recovery ones, even on the flight. Like you can be doing these things to sort of manage the stresses of flying, for example, and just keep equipping them, empowering with those strategies is so important.
Definitely. And look, I travel from Sydney to the UK. So I have a 14.5-hour leg first up and then a 7.5-hour leg second up. And then there's a transition in the middle. So, but on the 14.5-hour leg, I will train twice on the plane up the back and do a banded session. There's stairs on the plane and I do all my banded work at the back. I take some recovery modality tools on the plane with me, for sure. And the airlines have been wonderful in allowing me to something as simple as requesting my meals to be served on destination time. So I don't get my normal meal as when the meal cart comes out. So there's strategies that we can put in place to help us be able to land. In my case, I have quite a long transit. I need to land and know that day one on training, I'm good to go. And I need to be able to present the best version of myself to the playing group on day one, not on day 3 or 4. So looking at ways that I can mitigate the effects of travel on myself, and then also having our plan for the staff. You've mentioned it's a pressure cooker environment, and we need to look after our own. What self-care work for us puts us in the best position to be able to deliver what we need to do when we're in an intensified, training camp and condensed competition schedule. So for myself, I focus a lot on the travel piece because I need to hit the ground running as soon as I land over in the UK.
Yeah, it's brilliant. There's some great takeaways, some insights there, because I'm obviously, I myself travel a lot for work and whatnot. And having those little, if you've got a long travel haul, really tight, making sure you've planned and timed your meals is a very important one to sync. Obviously your sleep, if you can manage to sleep on the plane, if you're going from northern to southern hemisphere or vice versa, but also having those routines. I get up and do my stretching. I haven't quite got the bands, but I think I'll start incorporating those.
Look, as far as our players are concerned, if there's no pick, it didn't happen. So I'm taking photos of myself at the back of the plane doing some exercise. But other things too, like I'll have 2 water canisters. I'll have a hot and a cold. right? And the hot one is a very small 600 ml canister. And what do you do with that? And that's my inhalation canister. So I will take the lid off that and just let the hot vape go up into my nose, right? So to try and help with some mucosal lining, a nasal spray, chewing gum, obviously sleep aids, as in earplugs, face mask. Thinking about ways that you can optimize your own self-care during long haul travel is one of the keys that we certainly look at with the teams. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love hearing that. So we've covered a fair bit already, Stephen, and we can cover a fair bit more, of course, in subsequent conversations. But is there anything else you'd like to share and provide with the listener about, what we've discussed? Anything of note?
Yeah, look, I think the key area is planning, and there's obviously the old adage saying that if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And even something as simple, I would challenge the listeners. And I seriously, and I mean this with all sincerity, firstly, write down your goals. Less than 5% of the adult population go through the physical act of writing down their goals. Everyone says they have goals, but less than 5% of that adult population actually write them down. So along with my players saying if there's no photo, it didn't happen, if you haven't got your goals written, you're not now conforming to yourself that you're going to make this contract with yourself about what you're going to do. So how do you expect to achieve it if you don't have it written down? So the first thing I'd say is, look, write down your goals, whatever that is for. Is it for your business? Is it for your personal life? Is it as an athlete? But write them down. That's the first thing. First and foremost, write them down. So that's the first thing. As soon as you do that, you're about 40% more likely to achieve them by going through the physical act of writing them down. Second thing you need to put a timeline in place. When do you want to achieve those goals by? And then what are the sequence of events that you need to put in place to allow you to be successful in achieving those goals? So now you've gone from writing goals to actually almost writing an action plan of how you're going to achieve them. Now I'm about 50% more likely to achieve those goals. The third thing, after writing them down and now putting together my little action plan, the third thing I'm going to do is actually tell somebody, Tarek, these are my goals and here's my action plan. By confiding in you, I'm now going to hold myself accountable because I know at some point I'm going to have to come back to you because you're going to say to me, hey, Steve, how did you go with your goals? Where you're at with those goals? Have you achieved them yet? So now I've made this conscious commitment to not only myself, but to you. Now I'm about 60% more likely to achieve them. So I've written them down. I've created actionable steps to achieve my goals. I've told somebody, you, now I'm going to make a time to come back and check in with you. So now I have the actual formalized accountability. Tarek, hey, in 3 months, I'm going to get back onto you. And if I haven't got back onto you in 3 months, I expect you to get onto me and follow up with me about my goals. Now I'm about 70% more likely to achieve my goals through going through that process. But when I talk to athletes regularly, where's your written goals? There's very few that have actually written down their goals. They all have goals and aspirations, but we need to write them down. So one thing I would do is challenge the listeners in order to write down your goals. What is it that you want to achieve? Process over product. Start by writing your goals down.
Beautiful. Yeah, so it is written, so it shall be done, as Ramses once remarked. That's brilliant. Yeah, I totally dig that. And there's a consistent question that I ask: if you could change one thing about the health, fitness, wellness, the athletic kind of context, what would that be?
I would say don't fall to the doom scrolling or the infinite scroll on your social media platforms or your online devices. Get off them. I was listening to a Science with Dr. Carl podcast not that long ago, and he was talking about memory. And one of the questions was around, has our memory got better or worse over time since all of the technical devices that have come into play? And his answer ultimately was that our memory over the years has actually got worse. Around 2006, our consolidated memory was around 3 minutes, where I could focus solely on one task without getting the wandering drift of my mind moving away from the task. To now, I think it's around 42 or 45 seconds. And a lot of that has been linked to the infinite scroll or the doom scrolling, where we are bombarded with advertisements by very smart marketing people all the time that have enough in it to capture our attention and take us away from what we're actually concentrating on. So look, I think if you can do humanity a favor and put your mobile phones away for an hour a day, all of that's going to be there when you come back to it in an hour. But as a self-care process, get rid of your devices for an hour and see how that goes with your own mindset, with your own self-care, with your own well-being, by not being governed by your mobile device.
Yeah. Brilliant. And especially if you got high level work and all of a sudden you've got your alerts, and I mean, it's a no-go, isn't it?
It's never ending. And the other one would be a colleague of mine were very excited the other day because they had just purchased a smart watch. And in the next meeting we had, all I saw the whole time was them doing this because all these notifications are going off, right? So it's gone from the notifications on your phone to having this thing going off. So I'm not sure whether that is work conducive, allowing you to stay focused and concentrate. So my challenge would be, try 15 minutes, move it to half an hour, stretch it out to an hour where you're off your device for a period of time and see how you go with that. So I think by doing that, because one of the things we find a lot in the social media world is there are significantly more and more influencers becoming involved with some potentially questionable practices, minimal education, but because I'm an influencer, I have a very good way of communicating and getting my idea across that sometimes is not grounded in science.
Yeah. Should we say influencer? Inverted commas, if you're just listening and you haven't seen me do that goofy. Yeah, look, it's so true. Again, it's not to generalize, but it's that trap that, all of us can fall into. And we need to sort of step back and kind of have these practices like you've said. And one of my little hacks is in the morning to not check the phone for the first hour. So I get up and do my routines, movement, breath work and so forth, meditation. Of course, I have the phone the first thing. And then when it has happened, it's alerted me straight to work mode, all of a sudden, do this, do that, check that.
It's a preconditioning format, right? Like we're preconditioned to that. So look, as I said, 15 minutes, get rid of it. And I know my daughter is doing speech pathology and she's doing a great job of that. She's going through uni. And one of the areas that the more I talk to her about it is now whether this is, if I can use the word or the term, a COVID hangover effect. I don't know if that's an official term, but the communication capabilities of young children post-COVID seem to have decreased. So I'm certainly enjoying a lot of discussions I've been having with my daughter around, what are the strategies that can be put in place to help those communicate that may have communication skills. And we talk a lot about young kids in particular and the whole screen time debate around just placing a screen in front of them. How does that help with their communication skills? What does that do? So look, I shout out to all our first responders, in particular nurses, medical, front line. They do an amazing job. So I think what can we do in that space where we take that time where we're away from our devices to do what we're doing today, and that's having a discussion. I think we lose sight of the personal side of communicating these days because, hey, it's easier for me to send you a message than it is to ring you. So take that time. Because once that time goes, we don't get it back, right? So go and talk to somebody.
And those of you who've stood the test of time, you've hit the 49th minute mark in our conversation. But really, really appreciate you, Stephen, as always. Your insights, your humility and your knowledge is profound. And I do hope that the listeners have got a lot out of our conversation. Should they want to follow you, what's the best way? I know we'll have things in the show notes.
Active on LinkedIn by pretty much just sharing other things that I find interesting. Not so much talk about what we're doing. Through the University of Southern Queensland, they can go to my research profile on there. And once they're in there, we do have a new project, which is the Student Athlete Empowerment Project, which we have up and running at the moment. A series of projects around To Win for 2032. We have an Eat to Win program for school children or for high school kids, a Girls to Win program, which is going great, a Protect to Win, which is our neck strength and concussion program. We have a Mind to Win program commencing in a couple of weeks' time. So really looking forward to being able to go into high schools with a lot of the academic smart staff that we have here at the university to deliver some consolidated education programs in that particular student athlete empowerment space as we move forward on our way to 2032 Olympics.
Fantastic. Yeah. And we'll have a link to your book. So those that want to check that out, so we can add that to the show notes, any other articles and anything that will edify them, no doubt. So look, we'll have you back at some point, I believe, dive a lot more into some of the specifics around recovery training, even for the general population. And I'm sure there's plenty of territory to cover. But again, thank you, Stephen, for your time.
Thank you. And thanks, listeners.
If you haven't already, we would be honored if you would consider subscribing and following us on your favorite platform. That way, you'll never miss an episode and you'll be the first to know when new episodes are released. We truly appreciate your support and we can't wait to continue to grow and connect with you